There are many challenges in funding social justice for people. I mean, I think the big one is that it is perceived as political, and it is political, but I think most things are, but just not so obviously. And so, you find that most people shy away, actually, from politics, and especially if it's in giving. Because for many wealthy people, I think giving is a privilege and a joy and a pleasure. And so to bring politics into it somehow seems to make it less enjoyable. The problem with social justice funding is that you have to have a long-term view. Even if you win a court case, you often don't see any change. Either the government doesn't have the capacity to implement the decision that was made, they don't have the will to do it, they don't have the finances, and maybe they just don't have the political will, So it's a complicated area to fund in.
Most funding goes to objectives that can be more easily met in a short-term framing, and that has to do with protection and advancement of individual rights. But there are at least 3 other very important quadrants of work that do not get much funding, and that is about social attitudes, it's about cultural practices, and it's about public policy. To address those spheres of work requires strong local actors in the countries of Southern Africa. Very influential even, international actors are not able to reach the depths of social attitudes, cultural practices, and public policies in this part of the world, not because they don't want to, but simply because they are not well positioned to be able to reach into those spheres of influence. But what we found when most funding flows from overseas into this work in this region is that there's a tendency to focus only on those individual rights sphere of work because it's what is possible to do. If we are to address these other spheres of work, we really do need funding from communities in Southern Africa, because funding, so giving, social giving, requires thinking, it requires affect, so people feeling the issues, being aware of the issues, thinking through them, and then acting on them. And so social giving from a local context is part of transforming the process. When people give, that's the last step for them of making a commitment to do something to change a situation. It's not the first step, it's the last step. So raising local funding is part of transforming the environment in which we work.
My greatest concern as a grant maker in South Africa is that as South Africans, or as people living in South Africa who are committed to our country, who are committed to our democracy, committed to our constitution, we have to find a way to ensure that each one of us contributes towards building a strong civil society. You can only rely on international donors and wealthy local philanthropists or regional philanthropists up to a certain point. There has to be a point at which, if South Africans are interested in a free media, you have to find a way to support it yourself. If you're interested in the right to education, then you have to start supporting local causes. And I think that over time, the ruling party and the opposition party will understand that civil society is actually not a threat to their political power. It's just a check on their political power. And one would hope that eventually they would understand the rationale for people with a lot of money actually giving their money away to very good causes, and not just to faith-based giving, but actually to social justice activism.
And you have to convince people that, the building blocks of democracy are all of these things. Defending the Constitution, advancing the Constitution, defending our democracy, defending the rule of law. All of these things are part of a democratic dispensation and actually need to be defended and built. And you can't take a back seat on that. You know, if we're to build a strong democracy in South Africa, people need to get involved. It's not just the poor who have to make an effort, but all of us. And rich people can obviously give money, but I think they also need to get engaged and be aware of what's going on and be aware of what they can do to make things better for the country and for themselves, for their families.
If we are able to tell these stories in a simple way, I have a sense that we may be able to unlock some of the giving. And I think another part of it, especially for high net worth individuals, is that I think the connotation around human rights, broadly speaking, is that it's anti-state and it's not very patriotic and so on. So if again for that audience you begin to make people understand what you mean, and that it's not really about anti-state activities, but about, you know, ensuring justice for mostly, you know, really marginalized and mostly, you know, poor people.
It's not that South Africans are not charitable. I think in fact, we're extremely charitable. It's, you know, with huge unemployment and the inequalities that we have, it would almost be impossible for you not to be charitable. But charitable is very different to building a strong civil society and philanthropic giving, which goes beyond just the soft giving. And I think that it's hard for a lot of people because, one, you have to see a track record of something actually being able to achieve a particular goal. But on the other hand, it's also difficult if you are reliant on government funding, if you're reliant on private sector contracts and deals. It becomes increasingly difficult for you to support independent journalists or to support NGOs that are challenging MTN or Vodacom or Pfizer Laboratory. And similarly, it becomes increasingly politically risky for you to support organizations that are challenging the South African government, be it on health or education or on the secrecy bill. So, yeah, I mean, I think this is why Atlantic's support of the social justice initiative is so important, because it's, you know, it's for the first time trying to create a mechanism with other local donors, and the idea is for that fund eventually to be locally driven, locally supported, and then in turn supporting local organizations that are trying to advance human rights, not just in South Africa, but in the region as well.
Atlantic had been significant funder of social justice activity in South Africa, and of sort of the broad kind of human rights field, and two initiatives emerged in that respect, or at least two. One is the Social Justice Initiative, and the Social Justice Initiative is geared again at mobilising resources from within South Africa to support this work, and again a large grant made with a challenging match to encourage local donors to support that work. And then the Fund for the Constitution, or to support constitutionalism here, was designed, I think, to encourage external donors to increase their support for this work in South Africa, and that has been done in consultation with the Ford Foundation and the Open Society Fund, but has levered in new money for this area of work in South Africa. So you've got an effort there to mobilise resources locally, and you've got an effort to draw in some resources internationally.
There should be other South African grant makers in this field. But when I looked around, there were none really. We were still relying very much on Atlantic, on Ford, on the Mott Foundation for funding to the sector. And it kind of intrigued me, actually, as to why, with so much wealth and so much inequality in South Africa, the wealthy were not seeing this as a priority area for funding. Undoubtedly, there is a huge philanthropic sector in South Africa, but it mainly focuses on more charitable giving. To a certain extent, it's moving more into developmental giving, but very little funding that challenges the system, that tries to go to the heart of the problem and fund projects that will change that system. You know, what the donors can do, I think, is to provide the startup money for NGOs to become more self-sufficient, to spend some money on the systems that are required to target the middle classes, really. There has been talk about targeting the unions, but I tend to feel that, you know, you're taking more money from a group of people who actually don't have that much money, and that there is a lot of goodwill in the middle class to fund, and especially if we're not talking about large amounts of money, that they can put in small amounts of money. There's no great risk there. It's quite anonymous funding as well. So I think the donors can help build the philanthropic sector. All I see for the sector is a growing need for resources, actually. You know, we are not a well-funded sector, and I don't see the international agencies bringing in more money or even coming into the country. I see more of them leaving the country. And so we have to look at different ways of accessing local philanthropy. You know, it's a process, and I think what we've discovered in the Social Justice Initiative is that it's just going to be very long term. This is not going to be something that we can do quickly. It's a one-on-one, individual, convincing, making the argument to people who are risk averse and politics averse in some cases.